can't you get this sort of done? We respect Britain. We were educated at Sandhurst, and all this sort. And why can't you build railways and airports? And we have so it's that sort of mentality. And I think that's what I was talking about. But to be absolutely clear, I didn't see this speech as a growth plan or a growth strategy, because you really want 30 or 40 projects like this. There was no public money really announced in that speech. Some of it would be backed by public money to help lever in the international investment. There's an industrial strategy we're waiting for, there's a trade strategy, there's an infrastructure strategy. Once you've got that, then you've got a comprehensive plan for growth. Right now, we're not entirely sure. And there's a whole load of trade-offs where I guess the Chancellor's say will win out in arguments in the Cabinet.
That's what I was then going to put to Chris. My little mini theory is actually the intended audience of this speech isn't necessarily like Emirati investors. It is people in the Labour Party who will be opposed to this, and it's basically having a showdown with them, and that's what the international investors are meant to see.
Yeah, I think there's a bit of that. Lots of intent, lots of signalling, bit of a showdown. I thought it was quite striking that the most previously vociferous opponents of the third runway at Heathrow, who are within the Cabinet, were doing a spot of almost Mandelsonian diplomacy about how their position used to be X and now it is Y, in terms of how they square their previous opposition with now being willing to back it, even if they wouldn't come out and enthusiastically say it was brilliant.
Including Rachel Reeves, who was previously against an airport expanding in her own area.
In Leeds Bradford Airport, although she was a previous backer of the extension of Heathrow, but others like Ed Miliband and Steve Reid, the Environment Secretary, were not, and they found ways of accommodating that previous view with the collective responsibility of being in a government that has the opposing view. You do, though, still have significant voices outside of the ring of government collective responsibility, but within the tent of Labour, not least Sadiq Khan, the Labour Mayor of London, who are vociferously opposing. But yeah, I think intent and signalling, and then also making the point internally to the party. Remember, this was the number one line on the ticket at the election, that growth was the defining mission, and this is their prospectus, if you like, their hope, that this is how you deliver it. So that reminder that, hang on, you were all signed up to this in the first place, even if we hadn't told you quite all of the levers that we might have decided since, or even thought of before, we would then be announcing the pulling of or encouraging others to pull once you're in government.
What's fascinating for me about what she chose to announce that day was the fact she chose to put Heathrow Third Runway so high, so central to that speech. Because I totally hear the argument about, for investors, it's an attractive proposition. And there are arguments that Rachel Reeves were advancing about why it's essential for growth. But it seems to me that when you make what you are billing yourself as a really significant speech on growth, which is such a key part of the government's mission, its number one mission, all the rest of it, and when you put Heathrow right at the top of that, you've got to make it happen, because otherwise it looks like you have failed on something you have billed as really huge. And Heathrow is still hugely contentious, and in practical terms, to the point Faisal's making, there's not a planning application that's been submitted. There's a whole process, no matter how streamlined the government chooses to make it, that it will have to go through. There's huge levels of opposition within the Labour Party, but locally as well. Some people will support it, but there is definitely opposition to it. And then all the questions about compatibility with climate, the arguments that Rachel Reeves is advancing around sustainable aviation fuel, but that doesn't negate the arguments on the other side. The other projects she announced, things like the Oxford, Cambridge, Silicon Valley Road, and all of the East Midlands industrialisation, the Lower Thames Crossing, the Trafford plans. The other things seem to me is less contentious, right? But particularly the Oxford, Cambridge plan, which has been in the pipeline for ages as well, let's be totally clear. There's a lot of people on board with that. There will be questions around housing, there'll be questions locally around the transport infrastructure, impact on the countryside, is it going to deliver for local communities? Completely. But it's less contentious, I would suggest, than the Heathrow Third Runway. Less politically contentious, less symbolic. And yet, she chose to kind of bank on that Heathrow happening and then saying we're going to get spades in the ground in 10 years. 10 years it's going to be operational, spades in the ground by the end of this parliament. She has set herself some very specific deliverables that she will now be measured against. And I think that politically was quite an interesting thing to do.
Also, you really get the sense that the English local election campaigns are starting to get going, even though it's not till
Well,
May.
how we
And
Think
we don't know how many
Yeah, but-
local elections there might be.
no, but
Oh,
all
yes.
these, all of
Right,
them.
some of
Yeah,
them
well,
are
this is-
unlikely to happen.
This
so,
is Alex's turf. Yeah.
Well,
And, but
pretty much,
yeah, because
might as well.
I suppose my question there is like, when does the rubber hit the road, so to speak, of like these things go from being like notional kind of aspirational things in a speech to actually local disputes where there might be some actual political skin in the game, and a governing party loses seats on councils and loses control
And
of
you think
councils.
the minute that now the government has so firmly committed to these specific projects, those discussions will start happening at a local level. You know, people will either jump on board and be wholly supportive or raise objections, because you've got to remember the government.
We focus on the projects because we can talk about them, but as I said, they're undercooked at the moment. But the wider nerdy theory here that the Chancellor's talking about with her team is what we call the supply side. So you go around and you look at all the barriers to growth, and she's literally asking investors and businesses what they are, and then you try and sort of deal with all of them sequentially. But the problem is that one of the biggest elements of what we call the supply side is the supply of workers and jobs, and on that count, immediately, not long term, they've obviously ended up with their tax changes increasing the cost of certain types of labour, particularly low-cost labour, when you include also the rise in national living wage. So that is an immediate, real, tangible impact upon business, domestic businesses that are noisy and come on our radio shows and on newscasts, versus a sort of theoretical future, long-run, big investor, big economic type shift, which is less certain.
Right, let's talk about the supply of episodes of Newscast, because there's a biggie coming next Wednesday, because we're doing our 5th